This year, I've thought a lot about what the peak was of gaming. I think we reached the peak and we're kind of on our way down a bit, and that's an argument that I think a lot of people would make in kind of a dystopian fashion. But I don't want to focus on the bad or what currently is going on. I want to celebrate, I guess, the good things that are behind us and that we have the opportunity to experience thanks to these older consoles or playing backup copies or whatnot, to be able to get your hands on some of those older titles that maybe you didn't play when you were a kid. I think you can make a definite argument that gaming improved throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. You take a look at an SNES game, you go step it up to a PlayStation 1 game. I think there's a clear improvement in quality there as you move from 2D to these, lower poly, but still 3D graphics. And then you take it a step further with the PlayStation 2, and there's a definite improvement going from the PS1 to the PS2. And then you just tack on, a handful more years, and all of a sudden you got the PS3, and we're into HD graphics, and we're kind of, it feels like, up to the modern age. I mean, it's crazy to think that the PS3 is over 15 years old, yet here's a console with, kind of modern HD graphics. Is there a definite difference between a PlayStation 5 game and a PlayStation 3 game? Sure, but I don't know if definite is the right word. It's not as big of a jump as you saw when you went from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 3. The improvements in graphics, the improvements in gameplay, just sort of quality of life that you see in these games have definitely teetered off. You could call it being a fanboy, and you could call it just enjoying the nostalgia of the era of gaming that I grew up with, but I really think that the mid to late 2000s were the greatest period of gaming, the ultimate peak of gaming as we saw it. I mean, this was a time when you had, pretty fleshed out single player experiences. You had multiplayer coming into the fray because, again, late 2000s, I mean, we're talking Halo 3. This is a much better experience than you were getting on something like Halo 2 when it was early online. I mean, I understand people have nostalgia for Halo 2 online, but that's early online. By the mid to late 2000s, I mean, you had Call of Duty 4 being online, Halo 3 being online, just a much more sound online experience, as well as still having those solid single player experiences on consoles that had HD graphics that, if you go back and play today, really have aged quite well. People also make an argument that, a lot of these larger franchises, I hate to poke fun at Assassin's Creed because that's what everybody does, haven't really improved a lot since that era. Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, now we're just listing Ubisoft titles, but even the sports games have not seen significant improvements since the time in the mid to late 2000s. And in just a general gameplay sense across the board, you saw in like the early 90s, games didn't necessarily have save files yet, so you move on to something like the PlayStation 2 and you get an improvement in the fact that there are saves now, but yeah, maybe it's not that frequently. You're not auto-saving yet, essentially. But by the time you were into this era, even heck on the PlayStation 2 in the early 2000s, you were starting to see autosave become more and more prominent, and because of that, it makes going back and playing these older titles much more accessible. I mean, that's just one example of a quality of life feature that we've seen brought forward since this era, that if you go back any further, you're missing out on it. You also started to see things like alternate control layouts at this time, just some wide variety of quality of life features that we've seen continue to be brought forward that weren't in titles as you go further back. I mean, heck, you think about like the PlayStation 1, there were probably not even options on most of those games to adjust things like screen resolution, brightness, contrast, things like that you get prompted with on seemingly every game anymore when you first boot it up to set those things up. But they were first brought out for, widespread use in the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 era. It's also a time when you didn't have the, I guess I would say, anti-quality of life features, and that was where you were hiding content behind paywalls, behind, alternative versions of the game. Yes, there are like deluxe versions of some games on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, but not nearly to the extent where it seems like every AAA release now has some sort of deluxe or premium version, or, maybe they have two extra tiers beyond the initial tier of the game that's, hiding some sort of extra content behind a paywall. You top that off with, you just have some microtransactions in general. I mean, you didn't see a lot of that in the mid to late 2000s. Sure, was there DLC for Call of Duty 4? Yes, but what you were getting for the money was much different than what you get for the same dollar now. And I mean, that can be said about anything, but it seems particularly true in gaming as more and more content seems like it's being segmented off. Now, beginning just after the late 2000s and the early 2010s is when you saw the introduction of online passes, as a lot of publishers tried to combat the used game market in a way that was exceedingly unpopular. So that was kind of a pushback that I think a lot of people would point out, but that was primarily in the early 2010s. And for those that enjoyed collecting physical games, that was still the way to go in the late 2000s. You had the introduction of games on demand on the Xbox 360, and PlayStation Network was also hosting, your full AAA releases for some titles, but it wasn't nearly the prominent, every single title is going to hit digital type of setup that we have now, where it was, it was the smaller titles that were going up exclusively digital. They had the Xbox Indie Arcade thing that was, every game was like less than $5 and made by an indie developer, and there were some gems in there, and again, all very inexpensive at less than $5. But the games on demand weren't nearly as much of, I guess, a pain as they were now. Yes, you had to have a hard drive for your Xbox 360, and if you had one of those 12 gigabyte PlayStation 3s, well, you were probably in the minority, but for the most part, you had 100 plus gigs on a PlayStation 3. So the idea of storing a full retail release game that you bought digitally was very practical at the time. It wasn't like you got 2 or 3 games on your hard drive and it was full necessarily, and it didn't take inordinately long to download them, even on the internet connections of that time period for most people, because you'd see a full retail release, AAA game, like 7 gigabytes or less. And that seems crazy to think now because the games are 50, 100 gigabytes, much larger file sizes. And you wonder how we went from, that to what we have now in just, the little bit of improvement that I feel like we've seen. So maybe I'm overselling how good an Xbox 360 or a PS3 game looks, but I mean, honestly, if you take a look back at them, this is the early era of HD gaming. This is the first console to be all in on HD, was this generation, and I really think that for that reason, these games have aged quite well, and it's shocking to me to think that, in a handful of years, these will probably be considered quote-unquote retro games, if they're not already. I think that the retro game cutoff is kind of the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the original Xbox right now, but we're probably only a handful of years away from saying it about really the first HD console, and that blows my mind and just makes me realize, that there are thousands of games on these platforms, and I haven't played hundreds of them at all. Like, there's a ton of content just in the past to go back and revisit. I could make an argument that I could actually just buy no new games ever again, and I could just play things that came out prior to, 2023, and I could just stop here, and I could just not buy any new consoles, just play old titles from here on out. And there are people that probably will do that. I don't think I'll be one of them, but hypothetically, I think that I could, because there's a lot of good content back there 10, 15 years ago that I never got a chance to play. I didn't have the time or the money to at the time when I was a kid, and it's still stuff that's worth revisiting and holds up pretty well. So what was your favorite era in gaming? What was the peak of gaming to you, or do you think we haven't reached it yet? I don't think there's a lot of people that would argue that we haven't reached it yet, but I would love to hear your opinions in the comments section. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.